Most people watched it happen and still couldn't believe what they saw. Nobody in the building had any reason to think the day would end the way it did. The call sheets were normal. The lighting crew had arrived at 6:15 in the morning, same as always. The warm-up comedian had done his 12 minutes, same as always. The audience, 239 people who had waited in a line that wrapped around the corner of Structural Avenue in Atlanta, had filed into their seats in the ordinary way that people file into seats when they are about to watch something they expect to be fun. There was nothing in the air, no signal, no static. The kind of day that looks, in retrospect, exactly like the kind of day that changes everything. It was a Wednesday in October of 2021. Her name was Ruby Jean Alcott. She was 67 years old, and she had come to Atlanta from a town called Faraday, Louisiana, population 3,200, where she had spent the better part of 4 decades working as a home health aide. She had taken care of other people's parents, other people's grandparents, other people's most fragile and frightened loved ones, for 38 continuous years, and she had done it with a specific quality of attention that her clients' families described, in card after card, stacked in a shoebox in her bedroom closet, as the feeling that someone was genuinely glad to be there. She was the kind of woman who remembered what day your husband's biopsy was scheduled, who brought the right soup without being asked, who could tell from the sound of footsteps in a hallway whether a patient was having a good morning or a terrible one. She had never been on television. She had never wanted to be on television. She had agreed to come on Family Feud because her granddaughter Imani had asked her 4 times over 6 months, and on the 5th time, she had run out of reasons to say no. What nobody in that studio knew, what the cameras would not uncover for another hour and 40 minutes, was that Ruby Jean had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours in 6 months. The thing keeping her awake was not the kind of thing that announces itself. It had no single beginning. It had assembled itself slowly, the way water finds a crack and deepens it over time. Until one morning, Ruby Jean had stood at her kitchen sink in Faraday and understood, with a flat and terrible clarity, that she had given everything she had to give and had arrived at 67, with nothing underneath her. She had worked her last paid assignment in April. The client, an 84-year-old retired school teacher named Mr. Arsenal, who had Parkinson's, and who Ruby Jean had cared for across 3 years and 8 months, had been moved to a memory care facility when his condition progressed beyond what home care could safely manage. Ruby Jean had sat in her car in his driveway for 22 minutes after saying goodbye to him. Then she had driven home and sat at her kitchen table for a long time. She had $6,400,000 in her checking account. She had a pension from her home health agency that paid $880 a month. She had Medicare. What she did not have was the certification that Louisiana's new home health licensing regulations required for independent contractors working with dementia patients, a certificación that cost $1,450 for the 2-week course, a course offered only in Baton Rouge or New Orleans, neither of which was Faraday. She had been trying to get registered for the Baton Rouge course for 4 months. The first session she registered for was canceled due to low enrollment. The second was full by the time her registration processed. The third had a wait list of 31 people and a next available date of March. Without the certification, she could not take new clients with memory-related diagnosis. In Faraday, that eliminated roughly 70% of the available home health work. She had not told her daughter Priscilla any of this. When Priscilla called on Sundays and asked how things were going with work, Ruby Jean said she was taking a short break, that she had earned it, that she was fine. That was the story. She had been holding it in place for 6 months, smoothing it down every Sunday like a bed she was making for someone else to sleep in. Her great-granddaughter Aliyah was 7 years old. She lived with Priscilla 20 minutes away and came to stay with Ruby Jean on Friday nights, a tradition that had run unbroken for 4 years. Aliyah was the kind of child who noticed everything and said half of what she noticed, which meant the half she said carried weight. In July, during one of those Friday night stays, she had climbed into Ruby Jean's lap while Ruby Jean was sitting in the rocking chair on the porch, and she had put both small hands on Ruby Jean's face and turned it toward her, the way children do when they want to be looked at directly. She studied Ruby Jean's face for a long moment. Then she said, "Grandma Ruby, you have sad eyes." Ruby Jean had laughed and kissed her forehead and said her eyes were just tired. Aliyah, had stayed in her lap for a long time after that, longer than usual. He had a small body, pressed close in the particular way that children press close when they sense something is wrong and decide the best thing they can do is not leave. Ruby Jean cried in the bathroom after Aliyah fell asleep that night. She stood at the sink and ran the water so it would cover the sound. The agency she had worked for most of her career had restructured in January. The new licensing requirement was part of a statewide update to elder care regulations that had been passed in good faith and designed to improve patient safety. And in most of the state, it had done exactly that. In Faraday and towns like it, small, rural, with no local training infrastructure, it had functioned differently. It had quietly removed the certification pathways that existed for workers like Ruby Jean. Experienced, deeply competent, unable to access a course that was only offered 200 miles away. The state had a provision for hardship waivers. Ruby Jean had applied. She had received a form letter explaining that waivers were reviewed quarterly. She had applied in May. It was now October. She had told no one about the waiver application either. Not Priscilla, not her friend Denise from church, who would have driven her to Baton Rouge herself and not said a word about it. Not el Pastor Reverend Mills, who had known her for 31 years and who she sat next to every Sunday morning while holding the exact expression of a woman who is at peace. Imani had asked her to apply to Family Feud on a Tuesday night in May, 1 week after Ruby Jean had mailed a waiver application. In a moment when Ruby Jean was sitting on the porch, watching the light change and feeling more alone than she had felt since her husband Clarence had died in 2014, the application had felt, in that moment, like something to do, like the proof that she was still someone who did things. She had packed her church dress for Atlanta, the burgundy one, with the small white buttons. She had pressed it the night before and hung it on the door. She had made sure Priscilla had a key to water her plants. She had called Reverend Mills to ask him to say a small prayer for her, which he did on the phone, which she was grateful for, because she believed in prayer the way she believed in the particular mercy that arrives when you have stopped asking for it by name. The Alcott family stood on the left side of the stage. Ruby Jean, Imani, Priscilla, her nephew Curtis, her cousin Delbert. On the right stood the Okafor family from Memphis, 5 people who had been sharp and generous and funny through the whole taping, the kind of family that makes a studio audience feel lucky to be in the room. The game went 3 rounds. Ruby Jean had answered 2 questions perfectly. The audience loved her. Steve Harvey had made her laugh twice already. Real laughs. The kind that rearranged her whole face and made her look for a moment like the version of herself that existed before the 6 months. Then Steve asked the question that changed the day. It was not a dramatic question. It was a Family Feud question. Something about what people keep in their car that they're embarrassed about. The audience laughed. Ruby Jean stepped up to the buzzer. She answered correctly. The board lit up. The audience cheered. And then Steve Harvey, the way he sometimes does, reading something in the air that nobody else has clocked yet, turned to her and said, very casually, in the cadence of a man who is about to say something that isn't casual at all, Ruby Jean, who do you do all of this for? The studio fell completely silent. It was not a scripted question. No one in the production booth had planned it. It came from the same place that Steve Harvey's best moments always come from. The part of him that watches people closely enough to see the thing they're holding back. Ruby Jane Alcott looked at Steve Harvey. Something moved across her face. Something that had been under everything for 6 months came briefly to the surface. And then, without planning it, without deciding it, she stepped forward and she put her hand on his cheek. Not a slap, not in the way that word makes you picture it. Her palm landed softly, the way you touch someone's face when you're crying and can't explain why. When the question they just asked you is the only question that ever mattered. When you suddenly understand that the reason you came here, the real reason, underneath the game and the lights and the burgundy dress, was because someone needed to ask you that, and you needed to be somewhere other than alone when it finally happened. She pulled her hand back and looked at it like she didn't know how it had gotten there. And then Ruby Jean Alcott, who had not cried in front of another person in 6 months, who had run the water at the sink so Aliyah wouldn't hear, who had made her voice sound like everything was fine every single Sunday, began to cry in front of 239 strangers and every camera in that building. The studio fell completely silent. A lighting technician in the grid above the stage stopped moving. A production assistant near the exit doors stood very still with her clipboard pressed against her chest. The floor director, a man named Anthony who had directed over 400 episodes, took off his headset. The camera operator directly in front of Ruby Jean, a woman named Serena, 12 years on the show, lowered her shoulder and let the camera rest and just stood there, not looking through a lens, looking at a person. Steve Harvey did not step back. He stepped forward. It took both of Ruby Jean's hands in his, and he stood there while she cried. And he didn't say anything for a long time because there was nothing that needed to be said yet. Then he looked at her and he said quietly in the voice he uses when he is not performing at all, "What have you been carrying?" The studio fell completely silent again. And she told him, all of it. The 6 months, the certification, the canceled course, and the full course, and the wait list of 31 people, and the March date that felt like a wall. The $880. The waiver application sitting in a quarterly review pile somewhere. The Sundays with Priscilla, where she made her voice sound fine. Aaliyah in the rocking chair, turning her face, saying, "You have sad eyes." She told it in the plain, undecorated way of someone who has been storing it in a very small space for a very long time and is finally, for the first time, letting it take up its actual size. Steve Harvey's jaw was tight the entire time she spoke. When she finished, the studio fell completely silent for the third time. Then it said 5 words that would run on every major news program within 18 hours of the episode's broadcast. This woman saved people's lives. Ed turned to face the audience. His voice had changed. "I want to talk to everyone watching at home. Right now, somewhere, someone who spent 38 years taking care of strangers is sitting by themselves trying to figure out how to pay for a course they can't get to. And the system that's supposed to help them has them on a list that gets reviewed 4 times a year." He stopped. 4 times a year. He let the number sit there. Nobody in that studio made a sound. But Steve wasn't done. It turned back to Ruby Jean. He told her he was going to make a call. Not a promise. A call. Specific and immediate. From the stage. Before the cameras moved again. It called a contact at a national home health workforce development organization whose number he had because he had spoken at their conference 2 years earlier. He explained the situation in 4 sentences. He handed Ruby Jean the phone. She spoke for 90 seconds. Then she handed it back. He made a second call, this time to a private foundation that had worked with the show before on audience member situations. He did not describe the call publicly. What happened as a result of it became clear within 10 days. The Okafor family had been standing on the other side of the stage through all of it. Laverne Okafor, the family's matriarch, was 63 years old and had worked in hospital administration for 28 years, and she understood. With the precise professional comprehension of someone who had spent decades watching systems fail the people they were supposed to serve, exactly what Ruby Jean had described. She waited until Steve finished his calls. Then she walked across the stage, stood in front of Ruby Jean, and took both her hands the same way Steve had. She sighed. "My mother was taken care of by a woman just like you. I want you to know what that meant." She said it looking directly at Ruby Jean's face. Then she said to her family, without turning around, "We're done competing today." Her son Marcus nodded. Her daughter Tiffany nodded. Her brother-in-law Raymond, who had driven up from Memphis and who nobody would have described as a man who cried easily, pressed his lips together and nodded too. The studio fell completely silent for the 4th time. The audience stood up, but Steve wasn't done. He paused taping for 27 minutes. He sat with Ruby Jean and her family at the edge of the stage. It confirmed that the Workforce Development Organization was sending a coordinator to call Ruby Jean within 48 hours. He found out the exact name of the certification course and the institution offering it. He asked Curtis, her nephew, to write down 4 names and numbers, which Curtis did on the back of his name card with a pen someone handed him from the production table. By the end of that 27 minutes, Ruby Jean Alcott knew that her certification course fees were covered. She knew that a private driver arrangement, organized through the foundation, would get her to Baton Rouge for the 2-week session. She knew that her hardship waiver application had been flagged for expedited review, following a call the production company's legal team made before taping resumed. The episode broadcast 7 weeks later. The clip of Ruby Jean's moment, from Steve's question through her answer through the 5 words, was viewed 13.4 million times in the first 48 hours. By the end of the third week, it had reached 41.6 million, becoming the second most viewed single-moment clip in the program's 45-year history. It was covered by 34 news outlets across 11 countries. The hashtag number RubyJeanStrong trended for 4 consecutive days. The comment section of the original upload received 261,000 responses. At the time of writing, the largest comment volume on any clip in the show's digital archive. 3 months later, Ruby Jean Alcott completed her certification course in Baton Rouge. She passed on her first attempt with a score of 94 out of 100. Her hardship waiver had been approved in the meantime, and the expedited review process it had gone through prompted the Louisiana Department of Health to revise the waiver timeline from quarterly to monthly for rural applicants. A policy change that affected an estimated 340 home health workers across the state in its first year. A year after that Wednesday in October, Ruby Jean had 4 active clients in Fairy Day. Aliyah came on Friday nights, same as always, and climbed into her lap in the rocking chair on the porch. She had not said anything recently about sad eyes. Ruby Jean did not know if that was because she was watching more carefully or because the eyes themselves had changed. She suspected both. Today, the Ruby Jean Alcott Home Care Access Fund seeded by viewer donations in the 10 days following the broadcast, which totaled $612,000. The largest viewer-driven fundraise in the show's history has helped 1,940 home health workers in rural parishes and counties across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alaba cover certification costs and transportation. It has partnered with 3 state health departments to advocate for rural access provisions in licensing reform. It has a waiting list, which Ruby Jean personally reviews every month, sitting at her kitchen table in Fairy Day, the same table where she sat after saying goodbye to Mr. Arsenault, and understood that she had arrived at a place she didn't recognize. The shoebox in her bedroom closet still has the cards in it. She has added a new one, a card from the Okafor family, mailed from Memphis 3 weeks after the episode aired. Laberne wrote 2 sentences in it. Ruby Jean has read them enough times that she doesn't need to open the card anymore to know what they say. There is a moment in that clip, a moment replayed 41 million times by people in every time zone, where a 67-year-old woman who gave 38 years to caring for strangers reaches out and touches the face of someone who finally asked her the right question. That moment keeps traveling because it carries the truth that every person who has ever spent themselves completely in service of others knows in their bones, and almost never gets to hear said back to them, that the giving was seen, and it mattered, and the person who gave it matters too. If this story found you today, leave a comment and tell us about someone in your life who takes care of everyone else. Share it for them, and subscribe, because we are here every week looking for the moments that remind us what it means to finally be found.